Noting that the Labor Party supports the bill.
I call David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Sir, I'm pleased to make some brief initial comments to this first part of the bill that contains, as we know, the purpose, the interpretation and the statement of binding the Crown. We'll say a great deal more about this bill later. You'll be aware, of course, that the Greens initially supported this bill at first reading in the belief that there is a place for an organisation of the type that this legislation seeks to establish. But we've changed our view on that, given, to a large extent, the objectives, the functions and indeed the operations of this new entity are so poorly defined in this legislation. There is still a great deal that is unanswered. There is a great deal that we simply do not know about how this organisation will be structured, even what the transitional arrangements will look like, how it will operate, what powers it will have. We do know they will be substantive and that there is a great deal of concern in the sector, both in the business and indeed in the research in the tertiary sector, in the CRIs and elsewhere, about how this piece of legislation is going to roll out. The question of functions, which are core to any organisation, to any piece of legislation, in fact, we absolutely do not know what are the boundaries, what are the parameters of some of the powers of this new organisation, not least of all around funding, allocation and administration of funding. We asked some very pertinent questions at Select Committee, to which we got answers along the lines of, come and ask us later when we've made those decisions, which will be after the legislation has been passed. That is an appalling process. That is a process that denigrates and indeed dismisses the importance of due parliamentary process. We had, as the points already been made by Labor speakers, we had 6 weeks from go to woe. We know that constrained submitters. We know, as the last speaker quite correctly pointed out, that the sorts of organisations that we would expect to make substantive comments about this sort of legislation are those very organisations that actually want to make well-informed, substantive comments, thoughtful comments based on reflection, engagement with their stakeholders. They had no time to make that. And the bill, the drafting of this legislation, is much poorer for it. We know that we don't know, in fact, what was the reason for the haste. Why have we been presented with a document in which even core functions and powers are so poorly described and outlined? What was the reason for haste? We've asked that question repeatedly, and I'd love to hear the answer to it. I understand entirely there's no reason to sit on one's hands when there's a need to be filled. Nobody on that Select Committee, indeed in this Parliament, wants to see legislation delayed just for the sake of process. But nowhere did we hear a compelling reason for such extraordinary haste in this instance. Sir, I think we understand that the title of the bill will be changed, and we'll talk of that later, but the reference to Sir Paul Callaghan has been made. We hold the late Sir Paul in the highest regard. I never thought in my life I would sit in a town hall in Wellington and listen to a person talking about the relationship between science and industry, and you could have heard a pin drop. It was like a rock star was on stage, making us amazing, an extraordinary scientist, an extraordinary communicator. Our reluctance in opposing this legislation is in part because we are very concerned that it's not seen as any reflection on that gentleman or his legacy. So the chair of the Select Committee, Nikki Kay, made comments about some proposed amendments which were rather prescriptive in her view. Sir, I take issue with that. She referred to the need for flexibility and innovation. I believe that the functions, the powers, the operating principles of this bill give the Minister such extraordinary control over the future of science funding and the creating of those relationships. But the very innovation, the opportunity for this organisation to act flexibly, to respond to business and to the research sector will be seriously constrained. It is and it will be a tool of the Minister. That is patently clear if one looks at the provisions, and obviously we'll be commenting on the detail of those later. But to suggest that the very sound proposals for amendments that were put up by the opposition parties were overly prescriptive, I think is unfortunate and doesn't accurately reflect the genuine concerns that this is so loosely drafted as to be unworkable.
Call Tracy Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to speak on part one of the bill around the purpose, and New Zealand First will be supporting this bill.